US Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman Roger Wicker stated bluntly that Putin cannot be trusted. Putin is a war criminal who belongs in prison, the Republican told CNN. Asked whether Putin wants peace, Wicker said the Kremlin will do anything to benefit itself. On the contrary, Putin has violated all existing norms of international law and his place is in prison, and it would be even better if he were executed, the senator added. Wicker also disagrees with Pete Hegseth's statement that Ukraine has no place in NATO. He considers this statement by the Pentagon chief to be erroneous, although he maintains normal business relations with Hegseth. The Republican also advocates for Ukraine to participate in negotiations with Russia and the US. Wicker does not yet understand why Washington has not yet invited the EU and Ukraine to negotiations, but admits that Trump may have some kind of plan. I think the best way to avoid a European war that would ultimately force us to intervene is to ensure that the rule of law that has been in place in Europe for 70 years is respected and protected. That's why we have NATO. That's why we have the European Union, Wicker said. On if he's concerned that Ukraine and Europe are not at the table yet in Russia-US talks, Wicker said, I don't know what the scheme is. There may very well be a method to all this, but said that ultimately Ukraine needs to be at the table to get a fair result. There are good guys and bad guys in this war, and the Russians are the bad guys, Wicker said. They invaded, contrary to almost every international law, and they should be defeated. And Ukraine is entitled to the promises that the world made to it. Wicker has been one of the Senate's chief advocates for Ukraine aid and pressed the Biden administration in its final days for a surge in US weapons for Kiev's forces. He wanted President Joe Biden to pull out the stops and lift restrictions preventing Ukraine from using donated weapons to strike inside Russian territory, and accused the former president of slow-walking deliveries.
Donald Trump pushed back Tuesday against Ukraine's objections to being excluded from talks between the US and Russia in Saudi Arabia aimed at ending the war in eastern Ukraine. According to Associated Press, he also seemed to suggest that Ukraine was to blame for a war that began only after Russia invaded that country. Speaking to reporters from his Mar-a-Lago estate, Trump said, "Today I heard, well, we weren't invited." Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. Trump didn't mention that Russia has also failed to end the war it began when it invaded its neighbor. A half-baked negotiator could have settled this years ago without the loss of much land, very little land, without the loss of any lives, Trump said, echoing his frequent claim that he could have prevented the Russian invasion. Trump said he thought he had a good chance to end Russia's war in Ukraine, but bristled at suggestions that the US and Russia had begun negotiations to end fighting occurring without Ukraine playing a role.
Do you have any message for Ukrainians who, after 3 years of fighting, might feel betrayed or disappointed at not having a seat at these initial talks in Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think I'm really disappointed in what's happened. I've been watching this for 3 years. It's a war that would have never happened if I was president, and I've been watching these people being killed at levels that you've rarely seen, not even close, since the Second World War. And I'm very disappointed. I hear that, they're upset about not having a seat. Well, they've had a seat for 3 years and a long time before that. This could have been settled very easily. Just a half-baked negotiator could have settled this years ago without the loss of much land, very little land, without the loss of any lives, and without the loss of cities that are just laying on their sides. You have those magnificent golden domes that are shattered, will never be replaced. You can't replace them. 1,000-year-old domes that are so beautiful, you can't replace that. A whole civilization has changed because of what. So when they're worried about not being seated, you mean somebody that should have gone in and made a deal a long time ago. You could have made a deal. This is one that could have made a deal. There was no talk of this during the Trump administration. Putin would have never, ever done it. And by the way, we wouldn't have had October 7th, you know that. We wouldn't have had October 7th. And I think I have the power to end this war. and I think it's going very well. But today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no people would have been killed, and no city would have been demolished, and not one dome would have been knocked down. But they chose not to do it that way. And President Biden, in all fairness, he doesn't have a clue. What he was so bad for this. He was so bad, so pathetic. It's so sad.
How would you counter the perception, because Russia's pushing for this, obviously, they don't really hold true elections, that would be a capitulation of some sort? How would you guard against potentially Russia installing a puppet government? And then finally, how would that new election have an impact on getting Zelensky to sign the rare earth minerals deal?
Look, you have leadership, and I like him personally. He's fine. But I don't care about personally. I care about getting the job done. You have leadership now that's allowed a war to go on that should have never even happened, even without the United States. Look, we had a president who was grossly incompetent. He had no idea what he was doing. He said some very stupid things, like going in for portions and all of the things. He made a lot of bad statements, but he's grossly incompetent, and I think everyone knew that. This is something that should have never happened, would have never happened. And I used to discuss it with Putin. President Putin and I would talk about Ukraine. It was the apple of his eye, I will tell you that. But there was never a chance of him going in. And I told him, you better not go in. Don't go in. Don't go in. And he understood that. He understood it fully. But I'm only interested, I want to see if I can save maybe millions of lives. This could even end up in a World War III. I mean, to be honest with you, you've been hearing now Europe is saying, well, I think we're going to go in and we're going to go. All of a sudden, you're going to end up in World War III over something that should have never happened. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, President. Before the end of the month. Very nice.
Probably.
Do you have a date in mind? Thank you, President.
Top Russian and U.S. officials are holding talks in Saudi Arabia in a bid to improve their ties and negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine. According to Associated Press, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov met in Riyadh on Tuesday. The meeting between the two countries' top diplomats in Riyadh would be their most significant since Russia invaded its neighbor almost 3 years ago, and is meant to pave the way for a meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Earlier this month, Trump upended U.S. policy toward Ukraine and Russia, saying he and Putin had agreed to begin negotiations on ending the war.